What did the Earth look like in the chaotic beginning? At that time, dinosaurs had not yet appeared. The world was ruled by even terrifying creatures. Earth resembled a living hell. Every so often, there would be a mass extinction event. This episode is a bit long. I will take you to witness the era before dinosaurs appeared, a time that could be called Earth's crazy phase. About 4.6 billion years ago, the dust and gas left behind after the formation of the Sun gathered together and formed giant space rocks hundreds of kilometers in diameter. These rocks constantly collided with each other and eventually fused to form the Earth. But this version of Earth was definitely not the one you and I are familiar with. This primitive Earth was practically a hellish existence. It was filled with boiling lava, intense radiation, and was frequently struck by asteroids. This state lasted for hundreds of millions of years. This period is also known as the Hadean Eon, representing Earth's hellish prologue before the birth of life. Until about 1 billion years later, around 3.7 billion years ago, the hellish environment slowly began to change. At that time, Earth's temperature dropped significantly, approaching modern temperatures. But that didn't mean Earth had become habitable. At that time, most of Earth was still covered in water. There was also almost no oxygen in the atmosphere. It was a desolate world, with only turbulent oceans and rugged rocky cliffs, and the occasional terrifying volcanic eruption. Yet in the depths of this dark ocean, something magical and unbelievable happened. Life was born. Although we are not certain about the exact process of life's origin, in the Earth's oceans, some mysterious chemical processes interacted with specific substances. Eventually, they gave rise to the earliest extremely simple single-celled organisms. Some of these organisms could even produce oxygen. Over billions of years, these single-celled fellows kept absorbing nutrients and releasing metabolic waste, living a simple life. But gradually, they began to change. They became increasingly complex. Eventually, around 538 million years ago, during the early Cambrian period, this transformation reached its peak. Before the Cambrian period, the landmasses on Earth had formed a supercontinent called Rodinia. But from the late Neoproterozoic to the early Cambrian, Rodinia gradually broke apart. The landmasses then regrouped into several larger continental plates. Among them, the Gondwana continent was the largest. It was these geological upheavals that quietly set the stage for the emergence of various life forms. Earth finally welcomed its highlight moment, the Cambrian explosion. The term explosion here doesn't refer to a fiery explosion. It's a metaphor describing the sudden appearance of many novel creatures. Single-celled organisms became a thing of the past. Complex life began to thrive. Most of the life forms we see today first appeared during this period, such as crustaceans, mollusks, ancestors of starfish and worms, all continuously evolving in the depths of the ocean. This explosion of life actually lasted tens of millions of years. But compared to the previous billions of years of slow evolution, this was undoubtedly a milestone and a major event. But scientists still debate to this day the true cause of the Cambrian explosion. Remember I mentioned earlier that some simple organisms could produce oxygen? One theory suggests that these organisms rapidly reproduced and significantly increased the oxygen levels, creating conditions for the emergence of more complex life forms. These new organisms began to prey on smaller life forms, initiating an evolutionary arms race that shaped the course of life on Earth. Regardless of the exact circumstances, Earth was already prepared by then for the appearance of these new species. The average temperature at the time was much higher than before. Ocean temperatures were around 30 to 35 degrees C. Combined with more oxygen and carbon dioxide, life had the opportunity for further development. And life certainly seized this opportunity. Eyes, limbs, mouths, exoskeletons, shells. All these adaptive features began to appear during this period. However, the animals that possessed these new features looked very alien and bizarre. Take trilobites, for example. These arthropods with frightening shells were widespread in the oceans. They fed on plankton, collected debris, and even hunted other animals. You can recognize them from the many fossils that remain today. In fact, trilobites were among the most successful animals on Earth. They thrived for hundreds of millions of years. But they weren't the only creatures to appear in the Cambrian. The ancestors of the earliest fish also emerged during this period. At first, they had soft bodies and no jaws, looking like eels. They represented the first true vertebrates. Like Hycoichthys, this strange creature looked like a worm, and though it appeared to have no spine, it actually had vertebrae. There were even weirder animals in the Cambrian period. For example, the extremely bizarre Opabinia. It was a creature that foraged on the seafloor. It looked like something a child would doodle, a randomly invented creature. Its appearance was messy and arbitrary. It used its long proboscis to catch prey and deliver it directly into its mouth. It could practically gobble up small animals in one bite. As the relationship between predator and prey became more established, animals had to find ways to stand out, or at least be tougher than the others. That's where Anomalocaris came in. It was the top predator of its time. It typically measured about 1 meter in length, which was considered huge at the time. This terrifying shrimp-like creature dominated the seas, feeding on soft-bodied animals like worms. It was truly the MVP predator of that era. With such an unstoppable predator around, other animals had no choice but to further adapt to survive, elevating the evolutionary arms race to a whole new level, at least in theory. Around 485 million years ago, just as everything seemed to be progressing steadily and life was evolving continuously, a disaster struck. As for the cause of the disaster, it remains a mystery to this day. It may have been a sudden drop in oxygen levels, or perhaps caused by volcanic activity, leading to a mass extinction event. But not all life went extinct. Creatures like the lovable trilobites survived the catastrophe thanks to their experienced survival skills. Still, this disaster was undoubtedly a massive apocalyptic event, and it marked the official end of the Cambrian period. The Ordovician period was about to begin. The Ordovician is largely defined by a major event known as the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. During this 30 million year span, continents shifted, sea levels dropped, and oxygen levels in the ocean rose once again. The shifting continents formed new islands. In the newly oxygen-rich surrounding waters, they created isolated habitats. These habitats were waiting to be colonized by new forms of life. Primitive fish continued to evolve, gradually becoming more like the fish we see today. But they still had a long way to go before evolving into fish like Nemo. Meanwhile, elsewhere, even more terrifying creatures emerged. Let's meet the Eurypterid. Also known as the sea scorpion, these predatory arthropods were not actually true scorpions. They were only given that name because of their long, spiny tails, pincers, and fearsome appearance. That's how they earned their fearsome reputation. Larger Eurypterids could grow up to around 1.7 meters in length. I've already added this creature to my list of animals I'm glad are extinct. Although they looked fierce, they were not at the top of the food chain. That honor belonged to the orthocone, a predatory cephalopod related to modern octopuses and squids. Orthocones could grow to an astonishing 7 meters in length. They cruised through the depths of the ocean, searching for prey. They searched for various arthropods like sea scorpions to feed on. They had strong beak-like organs capable of crushing hard bones and shells, making them the nightmare of all shelled creatures. But changes weren't limited to the animal kingdom. The plant kingdom was about to rule the world, too. Since the Cambrian period, primitive algae had already existed in the oceans, but were not very noticeable. Until the Ordovician period, when things changed. Algae evolved and spread onto land for the first time, appearing in the form of moss. In fact, the land back then wasn't so dry. These earliest land plants had simple rhizoid-like structures, with no true roots or other specialized structures needed to retain moisture. So they grew in moist areas along the edges of bodies of water. Even though it was a humble beginning, it marked the start of the plants' conquest of land. Equally important, plants began absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releasing oxygen. This process created conditions for the evolution of more complex life forms. The Ordovician period ended around 443 million years ago with another mass extinction event. This time, it was triggered by an ice age. But not the ice age you're thinking of. In fact, there have been several ice ages throughout Earth's history. Each one was incredibly destructive. This one was no exception. Starting around 460 million years ago, for the next 40 million years, glaciers covered the southern hemisphere, causing global temperatures to drop and affecting marine species populations worldwide. This affected the global population of marine animals. Although all major animal groups survived, their numbers were drastically reduced. Many important species, such as the orthocone, did not make it. In fact, around 85% of marine species went extinct in this disaster. Interestingly, some scientists believe the disaster was caused by the success of new land plants. They believe moss absorbed large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, creating a cooling effect that ultimately triggered the entire ice age. But regardless of the cause, one thing is certain. The Ordovician period had ended. At 438 million years ago, the Silurian period began. 40 million years after the Ice Age began, carbon dioxide returned to the atmosphere, and glaciers finally began to melt. Glacier melt caused sea levels to rise until the climate stabilized. Life was once again able to expand. With the orthocones gone, the sea scorpions rose to dominance. They became the top predators. They thrived like never before, diversifying rapidly. For example, giant sea scorpions could grow over 2 meters long. They became even more terrifying. Meanwhile, other fish continued to adapt to their environments. The earliest jawed fish appeared during the Silurian period for the first time. This was a major milestone in vertebrate evolution. Additionally, the first large coral reef systems also appeared. They formed an important part of these new, diverse ecosystems, providing shelter for resilient trilobites and other creatures. Providing them with shelter. Meanwhile, land plants were also growing stronger and more dominant. Plants began developing more complex and recognizable forms, evolving into vascular plants with stems that could absorb and store water independently. These plants formed the foundation of modern plant life. As they continued to evolve, Earth's atmosphere underwent another oxygen increase. This time, however, it didn't lead to another ice age. Instead, the world went in the opposite direction. The extra oxygen was enough to sustain life on land. At this point, arthropods also began transitioning from sea to land. The first wave may have been myriapods, such as centipedes and millipedes, as well as arachnids, like scorpions. These terrifying, crawling creatures initially left the ocean perhaps to escape predators or to search for new sources of food. But a whole new environment waiting to be conquered was simply too attractive. Life in the oceans had become highly competitive, while the land was like a new playground full of opportunity. Of course, not every species that left the ocean immediately abandoned gills and learned to breathe air. Scorpions from the Silurian period, even on land, still retained their gills and had to keep them moist in order to breathe properly. So they did not venture far from the water's edge at first. The Silurian period ended around 419 million years ago. During that time, there were some relatively minor extinction events, possibly caused by climate change. I say relatively minor because unlike other extinction events, these didn't completely wipe out life on Earth or render the planet entirely barren again. Instead, the Devonian period was about to begin, arguably the most influential period since the Cambrian explosion. First of all, the earliest known sharks began to evolve, but they looked nothing like the predators we're familiar with today. In fact, in the marine ecosystem at that time, placoderms held a higher status, such as the massive Dunkleosteus. This beast was the top predator of its time. Estimates suggest it could grow up to 8 meters long. Dunkleosteus was without a doubt the largest creature of its era, and one of the most intimidating fish to have ever existed. Its massive head was lined with blade-like teeth, resembling a guillotine. Experts believe its bite force was stronger than that of a saltwater crocodile. And that's saying something, since saltwater crocodiles have the strongest bite of any living animal today. Dunkleosteus had more than double that bite force. And then some. Just looking at its jawbone shows how terrifying it really was. But fish weren't the only organisms growing larger on Earth. Plants were also evolving rapidly. Thanks to all the previous evolutionary buildup, the first trees with wooden trunks, complex root systems, and branches began to appear. They formed the earliest forests, producing more oxygen for the atmosphere while absorbing vast amounts of carbon dioxide. All of this made terrestrial ecosystems more attractive to new forms of life. Eventually, vertebrates began to stir. Some fish, like lungfish, were already able to stay in shallow waters for extended periods. Some could even crawl briefly onto land. But during the Devonian, everything changed. The most iconic example was the Tiktaalik. It was the earliest known vertebrate capable of breathing air. A vertebrate. This strange creature had characteristics of fish, amphibians, and reptiles. It was a peculiar transitional species between the ocean and the land. Though it still spent most of its time underwater, it could crawl onto land when necessary. There was also Ichthyostega, one of the earliest four-limbed animals, with fully developed limbs. But even these creatures still spent most of their time in the water. Meanwhile, arthropods that had already moved onto land began to diversify. Wingless insects and spiders continued to evolve and spread. But for creatures still confined to the oceans, things were about to take a turn for the worse. Near the end of the Devonian period, oxygen levels in the ocean began to plummet. Without the oxygen needed to survive, massive numbers of marine species began to die off. Even hardy survivors like trilobites and sea scorpions suffered sharp population declines. While some survived, their populations never recovered to former levels. Once dominant species, like Dunkleosteus, went completely extinct. As many as 70% of invertebrate species perished. We still don't fully understand what caused the sudden drop in oxygen levels. The cause is believed by scientists to be related to trees. Related to trees. Some trees of that era could grow up to 40 meters tall, and therefore required extensive root systems to support themselves. Roots not only anchored the plants and absorbed nutrients, but also altered the surrounding soil environment. They broke down rocks and created nutrient-rich soil. The problem was that this soil layer was very thin on Earth's surface, and much of it was washed away by rivers and into the oceans. Along with it, nutrients were lost too. This triggered massive algal blooms in the oceans. And when those algae died and decomposed, they consumed oxygen in the water. For marine life, this was nothing short of a disaster. Who would have thought that plants could cause so many deaths? While marine creatures were being decimated, land organisms were thriving and flourishing. Earth's ecological balance underwent a significant shift. This ushered in the Carboniferous period, a time when land life truly came to dominate. Beginning around 359 million years ago, the Carboniferous witnessed a flourishing of terrestrial plants. Vast forests and swamps covered much of the Earth's surface. This immense amount of vegetation drove atmospheric oxygen levels to unprecedented highs. This had some astounding effects on the animals of the time. Remember those arthropods that first ventured onto land in the Silurian? Now, they had had enough time to evolve and adapt, spreading to every corner. The surge in atmospheric oxygen levels provided them with new evolutionary opportunities. Arthropods absorbed oxygen through small pores in their bodies. With abundant oxygen and plenty of new plant food, they grew to enormous sizes. Like the Arthropleura, which could grow over 2.5 meters long. Fortunately, the Arthropleura was a vegetarian. Even among winged creatures, giant dragonflies were the largest flying insects in history. They had wingspans of up to 75 centimeters, nearly as large as an American crow. Tetrapods also multiplied rapidly on land and in water. The early amphibian Crassigorinus evolved during this period. It looked very peculiar, about 1 meter long, with a boomerang-shaped head. According to experts, this head shape helped it swim in water or scare off predators. Any creature trying to swallow it would have a hard time. But the real evolutionary leap for tetrapods came from their development on land. Although they had been living on land for a long time, they still had to return to water to reproduce. Until one amazing adaptation changed everything. With the emergence of amniotes, these land-based tetrapods began laying hard-shelled eggs. These new eggs could retain amniotic fluid inside the shell, eliminating the need to lay them in water. The shell also protected the young from predators. Thanks to this adaptation, tetrapods were finally free from dependence on aquatic environments. They became the first true amniotes. They were also the ancestors of most modern land animals. Tetrapods evolved this ability at just the right time, which turned out to be very fortunate because at the end of the Carboniferous period, Earth underwent massive changes. Over millions of years, Earth's tectonic plates continued to shift, and around 335 million years ago, they merged into a supercontinent called Pangaea. This massive geological event had a profound impact on life. Many inland areas became dry, and plants that relied on moist environments declined rapidly. The collapse of rainforests destroyed massive ecosystems, causing global oxygen levels to begin dropping. With temperatures falling and the Ice Age approaching, tropical ecosystems could no longer survive. The formation of Pangaea triggered a chain reaction of events that brought the Carboniferous period to an end. Around 299 million years ago, the Carboniferous period ended. What followed was a drier world with much less forest coverage. Compared to before, it was almost unrecognizable. Many species went extinct due to this massive climate shift, including those giant arthropods that depended on high oxygen levels to survive. But the amniotes managed to survive because they didn't need to return to water to reproduce, and their scaly skin helped prevent water loss. Such conditions prepared them to take over the world. Amniotes split into two major groups, synapsids and sauropsids. The former were the ancestors of mammals, while the latter evolved into reptiles and birds. Everything began to fall into place. Next came the Permian period. Temperatures began to rise. The glaciers formed in the previous period slowly melted. Inland areas turned into dry deserts. As the Permian progressed, the supercontinent grew increasingly hot. The living environment became extremely harsh. Only animals capable of efficiently conserving water were able to thrive. Synapsids and sauropsids continued to evolve and diversify across Pangaea, becoming the dominant land animals. However, it was the synapsids that truly ruled the Permian. Their slow and steady evolution increasingly resembled characteristics of mammals. Dimetrodon was one of them. It was a large and not so pleasant-looking creature. Due to its massive size, it was often mistaken for a dinosaur. Dimetrodon was the apex predator of the early Permian period. It could grow up to 4.6 meters long, about the size of an SUV. It was hard not to become the dominant species. As for the large sail on its back, there is still no scientific consensus. Some scientists believe the sail helped regulate body temperature, while others believe it was used to attract potential mates. Dimetrodon became the new ruler of the Earth. But after ruling for 16 million years, it eventually went extinct. By the end of the Permian period, another synapsid called Gorgonopsid rose to the top of the food chain. These ugly-looking animals were not as large as Dimetrodon. The largest ones reached about 3 meters long, but they were highly lethal. Gorgonopsids had mouths full of strong teeth up to 15 centimeters long. These teeth were probably used to tear through the flesh of their prey. Just thinking about it is chilling. The Permian period also gave rise to one of the largest animals in history, Cotylorhynchus. Just look at its tiny head. Its neck was barely visible. It was a cute herbivore, but don't get too fond of it. As mentioned earlier, the Permian period got hotter and hotter. Over the course of 1,000,000 years, the Siberian region experienced a series of massive volcanic eruptions. Vast amounts of scorching lava spread across the world. These lava flows were enormous in scale, releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide got trapped in the ozone layer, causing Earth's temperatures to rise dramatically. Animals had to struggle to adapt. Marine life, in particular, was worse off than land animals. The ocean absorbed some of the carbon dioxide, causing the seawater to become highly acidic. Soon after, the high temperatures sparked wildfires on land, burning what vegetation remained. As plant life disappeared, rocks on the surface were exposed to the elements, were rapidly eroded. A large amount of minerals and nutrients were carried into the ocean by rivers. This inadvertently triggered a massive bloom of marine organisms. That might sound like a good thing, but it was actually not. The explosion of new life wasn't a blessing, it was a disaster. They consumed the last remaining oxygen in the ocean, causing the few creatures that had survived the initial catastrophe to suffocate and die. By the end of the Permian period, about 251 million years ago, this apocalyptic disaster reached its climax. This event is known as the Great Extinction. It was the most devastating mass extinction event in Earth's history. Life almost completely vanished. 70% of terrestrial animals and 90% of marine organisms were wiped from the face of the Earth. The few that survived this catastrophe faced a world left in total devastation. Keep in mind, everything we've covered so far belongs to one major era, the Paleozoic era. With the Great Extinction, not only did the Permian period end, but the entire Paleozoic era came to a close. This era spanned nearly 300 million years. But the story doesn't end here. Life continued. The Mesozoic era began. This era would eventually give rise to dinosaurs. But the start of the Mesozoic era wasn't very dramatic at all. In the first 5 million years of the Triassic period, life gradually recovered. Eventually, new dominant species began to emerge. The living environment in this new world was extremely harsh. Only the most resilient species had a chance to survive. Unfortunately, most synapsids did not make it through. They were severely impacted by the mass extinction. Although a few managed to survive and eventually evolved into modern mammals, they remained in a subordinate position for a very long time. Diapsids, on the other hand, were different. They were well prepared. Thanks to their hard-shelled eggs, they could live far from water sources. Their scales also helped them retain moisture. During the Triassic period, diapsids diversified rapidly and evolved at an unprecedented rate. Some ventured into the open oceans and evolved into the earliest marine reptiles, like the ichthyosaurs, whose bizarre and terrifying appearance resembled fish, but with unusually large eyes for the animal kingdom. Nearby, plesiosaurs also roamed the oceans. These equally strange creatures had astonishingly long necks, possibly helping them hunt more stealthily. These two types of marine reptiles thrived for over 100 million years. There were also some unusual creatures, such as drepanosaurs, which evolved into tree-dwelling animals. They were perhaps similar to today's lemurs or sloths. They could hang upside down from trees using their tails. Drepanosaurs also had extremely long claws used to poke at insect nests hidden in branches. They were like a hybrid between monkeys and lizards. But trees were not the final destination for these newly evolved reptiles. Some even began evolving toward flight. For example, Longisquama. Unlike most flying animals we are familiar with, its wings were located on its hind legs, so it couldn't truly fly, but could only glide awkwardly. By the end of the Triassic period, this evolutionary feature had improved. Pterosaurs emerged. Their bones were hollow and filled with air, which made these flying reptiles light enough to achieve flight. Their wings extended from the forearm all the way to the ankle. In short, pterosaurs left Longisquama far behind. We've talked about oceans and skies. Now, let's look at what was happening on land. The once dominant synapsids were nearly wiped out. A subgroup of diapsids, the archosaurs, took their place and achieved great success. Archosaurs had highly efficient respiratory systems, which allowed them to survive in harsh conditions. After the mass extinction, CO2 levels in the atmosphere were extremely high. Oxygen might have been quite scarce, but their outstanding respiratory system allowed archosaurs to thrive while other species struggled. Not only that, archosaurs also quickly evolved upright limbs. That may not sound like a big deal, but it gave them a major advantage. Four-legged animals like modern lizards have limbs that extend sideways. When they move, their bodies bend from side to side. This pushes stale air from one lung into the other lung instead of out of the body, so they can't expel it properly. This means they can't breathe properly while moving. But archosaurs, with their upright limbs, solved this problem perfectly. There was one particularly terrifying member among the archosaurs, the Postosuchus. It was 5 meters long and a top predator. This monster looked like a hybrid of a T-Rex and a crocodile. Just the thought is spine-chilling. It preyed on nearly all protein-bearing creatures. Some experts believe Postosuchus chased its prey on all fours, but when close enough, it would stand on its hind legs and bite at the prey's neck or back. A terrifying move. This made Postosuchus even more frightening. In fact, its reign of terror lasted until just before dinosaurs appeared. During that time, it firmly maintained its dominant position. At that time, archosaurs ruled the world. But in the middle of the Triassic, another major evolutionary change reshaped the Earth. On the barren land, a few seemingly ordinary branches of archosaurs emerged. But they were anything but ordinary. These were the earliest dinosaurs. They not only inherited all the advantages of their ancestors, but also reproduced rapidly. At this point, they were ready to conquer the Earth and usher in a whole new era. Thanks for watching our video till the very end. If you find this video interesting, feel free to share it with your friends. Finally, don't forget to hit a like button and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next video. Goodbye.